Okay, welcome to Media Arts Futures at York University. Today's event is In Conversation with Susan O'Connor. It is so fabulous to have you here, Susan.
It's my honor. I'm super excited to share with you guys and have a chat.
Fabulous. All right, so we're just going to start with a land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Toronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Susan is in Austin, Texas, home to the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo. My name is Alison Humphrey. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Cinema and Media Arts here at York University in Toronto, where I've also had the opportunity to design and teach a new first-year course called Writing for Games and Interactive Media. Shout out to my awesome students in the audience today. I look forward to all the great questions you'll be asking Susan in the Q&A after the talk. So today's event is part of a new series sponsored by the department called Media Arts Futures, where we invite illustrious speakers from a range of creative realms to talk to tomorrow's media artists about the past, present, and possible futures of their art forms. So it is my honor today to introduce Susan O'Connor, founder and CEO of the Narrative Department. Susan's first job as a game writer was for a slumber party game for girls. She's gone on to work on over 25 projects, including award-winning titles in the BioShock, Far Cry, and Tomb Raider franchises. Titles in her portfolio have sold over 30 million copies and generated over 500 million in sales. She's also an adjunct professor at University of Texas, Austin, where she teaches a course on writing for games. And a long time ago, she founded the Game Narrative Summit at Game Developers Conference, GDC. Now she partners with studios, publishers, and writers to help teams ship great games with great stories. She's dedicated to supporting creatives in the games industry so that they can do their best work. You can find lots more fantastic insights on writing for games at her website, thenarrativedepartment.com. But for now, I am thrilled to be able to turn it over to Susan live and in virtual person.
Yay, amazing. First, thank you so much for sharing that insights about the Indigenous people who are here. As you might imagine, we don't do that, and we really should. So it was my first time hearing that. That was really powerful. And yeah, we have a big responsibility, all of us, don't we? Anyway, I'm just so excited. Speaking of being responsible and trying to be thoughtful to the community, you guys are part of the community, the creative community. You're about to, you're going to be in college for a while, and then you're going to go out into the big world and try to make your way as a creative, just like I did. So I really hope that this talk today answers some questions, like plants some seeds, gets you excited about what's possible, because anything really is. So I think the structure of today is I'll be sharing a slide deck and sort of giving the traditional lecture, and then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. So as we're going, please feel free to like be thinking of questions. And of course, you can chat amongst yourselves. I won't be looking at the chat, but I mean, I'm a game writer. My whole job is about encouraging people to interact. So it is totally fine if you chit chat. I think it's great, in fact. Okay, so Alison, I shall share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, let's do it. Hello. Okay, great. Alison, can you see?
I can see your slides and a little tiny Susan at the side of it.
Okay, I'll take it. Perfect. All right, guys, let's get started. For writers, games are the new frontier. Oops, click. There we go. And I love the artwork from Red Dead Redemption, and it ties in with the frontier So I just love this picture. And I love showing this. I gave a version of this to the Austin Film Festival a few years ago. And a lot of the people there were not gamers. And I was like, what movie do you think this is from? And people were guessing. I'm like, it's a game. I mean, there's just no doubt that the level of art in games has just become phenomenal and breathtaking. And I think storytelling is headed in the same direction. That's what we're going to talk about today. So first of all, I just want to thank York University for bringing me in. Alison, who was actually a participant in my game writing masterclass this past fall. And I have to tell you, your professor is a fantastic student. It was such a pleasure having her there. And she shared a lot of her insights with us. And she was kind enough to invite me to come. So it's thanks to her that I'm here. So thank you, Alison. Okay, and I also appreciate you guys. You've got a lot going on. University is a busy time, and you have a lot of other things you could be doing, but you're here. So hooray, thank you. You get a cute dog. That's my way of saying thanks. So as Alison said, I've been working in games. You've heard all this stuff before. So that is my background. I've been doing this a really long time and worked with lots of different studios on lots of different projects. Some of which were great, some of which were not great, but all of them helped me learn. And I'm going to try to share some of what I've learned here today. Okay, so let me give you a preview of what I'm going to be sharing in this talk today. So I'm going to share why games will impact your writing career or your creative career in general, even if you never actually end up working in games. I'm going to explain to you guys what game writers actually do, which is not what most people think game writers do. And then finally, we're going to take a look at like the future of storytelling, basically. We're going to take a look at the kinds of stories that only games can tell. And it's just the tip of the iceberg, but it might spark your imagination and be a good segue into our Q&A. Okay, let's get started. So what does it mean to write for games and why should you care? So this next section is going to be kind of a broad look at like the bigger picture, how games fit into the wider world. So something to know, the reason you should care if you're interested in building a writing career is that game studios need you. They really do. So I'm going to show you some statistics, and usually statistics are really boring, but these statistics tell a story, and that story involves you. Okay, so this is from, this is a group called the Entertainment Software Association. Their website is esa.org. And they release like an essential facts PDF every year. And again, it's the kind of thing that studio heads read. So it's got a lot of facts and figures, but there's some really good information in there for creatives who are thinking about building their path. So this is from a few years ago, as you can see, 2018, but between 2016 and 2018, there was this big jump in terms of how much people were spending on video games, right? And you can see that most of it is down here, the 35.8 is in content. So these are huge numbers, right? I mean, that is a huge number. If it's total, $43 billion in 2018. And then just this morning, before I gave this presentation, I went to look at their 2022 report, okay? By the way, I realized that at this scale, these numbers mean nothing. Like, it's really hard to fathom 1 billion, much less 43 billion. But just in terms of like, in comparison to the numbers before, how quickly they're jumping. So in 2019, 43.4, 56.1. So that's in the space of 1 year. Now that was the pandemic year. So people had a lot more time to play games for sure. But in 2021, the number kept going up. And as always, for writers or people who do creative work, what's really important is that number. Like how much of that money is being spent on the games themselves versus, say, the platforms, right? So it's not the Xbox or the PlayStation that's bringing in all the money. It's the Xbox and PlayStation games. So the point is, this is a huge, huge industry. Now, someone looking at this might think, yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's good for writers, except. So they, again, in the same report, they take a look at like, well, when they ask gamers, like, when you are ready to buy a new game, what affects your decision? Like, how do you pick your next game? And these are the top 5 reasons: price, quality of graphics, interesting story or premise, familiar from past experiences, or a continuation of favorite game series. So 57% of gamers, if this game has a good story, they're more likely to buy that game. And game studios are real interested in selling games to players. So if they know that a game with a good story will be a game that people play, then studios want to ship that. So aside from the fact that like game studios are really interested in delivering better stories to players because players want them, and again, lots of really smart business people are like seeing like, oh, I should maybe get involved with this, right? Amazon is, Netflix, I think at this point, this was from 2021. I think they just purchased their 6th game studio. So they're exploring what's possible for sure. And so while this is booming and expanding, this guy, coronavirus, has had a really serious impact on all kinds of industries, for better or for worse. So let me sort of walk through how that's affected film, how it's affected TV, and how it's affected games. So, of course, we're hopefully on the tail end of coronavirus, but the reality is that our habits have changed as a result of coronavirus. So, of course, during the depths of the pandemic, a movie theater was the last place you wanted to be. And the reality is that the audiences are not coming back, not the way they used to. So Hollywood is really panicked because that's a huge part of how they deliver their goods is in a theater. And if people would rather just watch at home, then they've got to rethink what they're doing. TV had the same problem, right? They just couldn't. Television requires people to be together in close proximity talking at each other. And when you've got a pandemic, that's really not the thing to do. So both film and television industries have really suffered and are continuing to figure out how to move forward. It's just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of stress in those industries. But the reality is that the pandemic actually, it either didn't impact the games industry at all, or it made it kind of pandemic proof. The reality is that every studio that I know is doing some version of remote work. I don't know any studio that hasn't switched either partially or fully to doing remote work. And, right before the pandemic, studios were really adamantly against the idea of remote work. They thought people were just going to be sitting at home, not doing anything. But the reality is, and that's why I showed that screen before, when you work on a video game, this is your workplace. And this workplace could be anywhere. Game studios were already using Slack and Discord and text and email and whatever to communicate with people who are across the hall. And that's no different than communicating with those same people from home. So what this means is not only are they working remotely, but they're also hiring remotely. I know writers from my masterclass who are working with studios and they've never met their coworkers in person. All the work's being done remotely. And what that means is it no longer matters where you live, right? And so you as Canadians could work with a studio in the UK, you could work with a studio in Australia. You've got lots of different options. And you'd be surprised how very open they are to bringing you on board, no matter where you are. And there's tons of studios. So there's a website called gamedevmap.com, GAMEDEVMAP. So it's short for Game Developers Map. And you can go there and you can shop for studios and you can do it by location. But it's incredible. There are 77 game studios worldwide. So I like looking there sometimes. I fantasize about moving to France and I'm like, look at all those game studios in France. But again, I don't have to move. I could just work from them from here. But of course I want to be in France. Anyway, so I hope that all these facts and figures, as dry as they are, sort of help you to see oh, there's a huge opportunity here if it's something I want to do. Big if. And let's talk about that. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. Because a lot of people are like, oh God, are you kidding? Writing for games? Have you seen the writing in games? They're terrible. You may not think this because I think you're of a generation that's getting exposed to much better storytelling, but people in their 30s and up are like, yeah, I've seen some pretty bad storytelling in games. And, fair enough, right? There certainly are plenty of examples of games with like stories that are so bad you can't believe they shipped it. And the reality is sometimes stories in games are kind of over the top and ridiculous and hard to take seriously. But, on the other hand, we've seen over the last several years, every year, multiple studios release games that are like mind-blowing. Their stories are incredibly affecting and emotional, and they totally transform the gameplay experience. I'm looking here at 3 examples. If you played any of them, The Outer Worlds, Florence, which I love, and Portal and Portal 2. Portal 2 especially, actually, because that's Portal 2 right there. Those are just 3 of, a 2 dozen, 50, 100 examples we could have put up here. And here's the thing. It's not a surprise. This was extremely predictable. Evolution as a concept applies not just to humans, but also to things like industries. There's evolution at work here, right? We start out a blob and we become Beethoven. And we've seen it at work across all kinds of industries. So for example, early film. Maybe you guys have taken a class in silent film here, or you've seen some silent films or some just early films, and you're like, this is ridiculous. There was a Professor Swain from USC talked about how, when films first came out, people were like, oh, this is never going to amount to anything. This is just for kids. This is ridiculous. Basically, they were saying the same things that people said a few years ago about games. But over the decades, film became the dominant storytelling medium of the 20th century. And same thing happened with TV. When TV first came out, it was glitchy, it was goofy. Some of the content was not the greatest. I think the person in charge of the FCC in 1961 just called it a vast wasteland. And look at it now. Look at the kind of shows that we have now. I mean, golden age of television, indeed. So same things are going to happen in games. When games first started out, they seemed very rudimentary and goofy and simple, just for kids, etc. But now, look at all these options that we have. And it just keeps getting better. So evolution is inevitable. It's happening, and it's going to happen whether we make it happen or not. It's just going to happen. But we have a chance to be a part of that evolution and help to shape it. And that's what's so exciting. So let me grab a drink of water and we'll keep going. Okay. This is a fun section. Games are changing audiences, and that is changing the way we tell stories. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, and as we've already hinted at, people play games, a whole lot of games. Again, this is from ESA, which is US centric, so I apologize for the US stats, but this is pretty true worldwide also, because I do cover worldwide statistics in that report. And I love this because the average age of a gamer is not 16. There are plenty of 16-year-old gamers, but there are plenty of, 45-year-old gamers too. I mean, people don't really ever stop playing games. That's what's pretty amazing. If you like them now, you're going to like them 20 years from now, 40 years from now. And so we were talking about this concept of evolution, and part of creative evolution is about learning, looking and learning. I love this quote from Pablo Picasso. He says, good artists copy and great artists steal. So what do I mean by steal? Well, let's talk about this. So there's this great book. It's a little dense and academic, but if you're good at reading academic literature, I recommend it. It's Hamlet on the Holodeck, The Future of Narrative in Cyberspace. This book came out a super long time ago, like 1996, but it was way ahead of its time. And honestly, it's still ahead of its time. And I think they just released a new version of it a couple of years ago with some updates to some of her predictions. Anyway, it's really thought-provoking. So in it, one of the concepts that she talks about is this really cool concept of, in fact, here, let me go back for a second. The concept is that every time a new storytelling medium comes along, 2 things happen. The first thing that happens is that the creative people working in the new medium kind of make a mess of things, right? Because it's new, they really don't know how to use it. They're trying a bunch of stuff. It's a lot of experiments and it's a lot of goofiness and yeah, which is fine. But what's more important is that the creative people working in the dominant medium of the day, those artists and writers, look over at the new storytelling medium and get really excited about what's going on and start stealing, AKA like taking the storytelling techniques they see there and then using it in their own work. So let me give you an example. Before games, the storytelling medium that came out before that was film. So back in the day, film was the new storytelling medium of the time. And the dominant storytelling medium of the time was novels. So if we go back and we read novels from like the late 19th, early 20th century, we can see in prose these writers using cinematic techniques. So for example, in Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte uses flashbacks, like describing visually flashbacks. Charles Dickens used crosscuts to make his stories move faster and be more interesting. Leo Tolstoy used panoramas and close-ups in his work. And again, they're only using words here, but they're using words to create visuals in the in the reader's mind. So this is a perfect example of stealing like an artist, right? Getting inspired and excited by the potential of these new ideas and trying them on for size. So that was then, and this is now. So now the new storytelling medium is games. And the dominant storytelling medium of the day is film and TV. So then we have to ask the same question, which is, well, how can we see film and TV, quote unquote, stealing from games? And the answer is yes, but maybe not in the way you might be thinking. So it is easy to think of movies who are like based on video game IP, right? Or very clearly tied to video games like Wreck-It Ralph, Tomb Raider, Mortal Kombat. But I'm actually talking about something a little bit more subtle and points more to the future of storytelling, which is movies that aren't advertised as related or connected to games, but are telling stories as games tell stories. So for example, Memento tells the story out of order. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty amazing. And it uses environmental storytelling because this character has short-term amnesia. And so to try to remember things, he has really important information tattooed on his body. So the environmental storytelling, the visual storytelling is happening on his body, and the out of order storytelling is something that I think would be really challenging for an audience maybe 30 years ago, but gamers are much more comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. And they're willing to kind of hang in there and see a story as a puzzle. Memento is very much about storytelling as puzzle solving, or puzzle solving as storytelling, which is very much like a game. Another Christopher Nolan story that feels like a game / movie is The Dark Knight, which has mods. It has a lot of sort of gamey concepts in it. In fact, one could argue that Batman and the Joker are playing different games, quote unquote, in this movie. And it's one of the reasons Joker is able to dominate is because he is not playing the same game as Batman. He's playing a different game. And part of what we have to do as an audience is what Bruce Wayne and Batman have to do, which is figure out what the game is and then how to beat it, which again is very much what we do in every game we play. And then finally, the movie from Christopher Nolan that I think is the most like a game is Inception. It's such an interesting example because it's a story about a man who hires a designer to build a set of imaginary levels. And then that man sends an avatar version of himself through these levels to accomplish a goal. Everything about that sounds like a game, not a movie. But what I love about this poster is that it doesn't say on the poster, warning, must be a gamer to watch this movie. And I think that is such a great example of how the way we tell stories in games has just become part of the zeitgeist. It's in the water. It's changing how audiences understand stories, and it's changing the way we tell stories. Because even if you're there watching a movie, the movie audience is full of people who also play and love games and are fluent in the language of games. And what Christopher Nolan is doing in these games is he's speaking their language. There's a really great New Yorker article called Christopher Nolan's Games. And in it, they say that his movies are easier to understand if you think of them as games rather than movies. And Christopher Nolan acknowledges that he is super inspired by what he's seeing in games, and he's using it in the films that he makes. So we talked about how storytelling in games is evolving. And I want to share a little bit more of that prophecy that I hinted at earlier. So I had said that when film first came out, people said, oh, it's silly, it's just for kids, it's never going to amount to anything. But then, of course, it did. So what was the change? What helped film go from being just a little diversion to being the dominant storytelling medium of the 20th century? Well, you could argue that what made the big change was that film learned to talk. When film went from silent to talkies, that was the beginning of the evolution that led us to some of the greatest films that we've seen in the 20th and 21st century. So, okay, if we're going to apply that to games, well, don't games already know how to talk? I mean, plenty of players think they talk too much. So Chris Swain argues that we're not waiting for games to learn how to talk. We're actually waiting for games to learn how to listen, to be able to respond to us in a meaningful kind of a way. And that's what I think a lot of game developers are doing. For example, this, of course, is a picture from Telltale, and they did something very simple in those Walking Dead games. When you made a choice in your interaction with the characters, sometimes you would see that appear next to their head. She'll remember that, so it's tracking what you've done, and it impacts your relationship with these NPCs. Another more recent example would be Hades. They wrote something like 350,000 lines for that game, so that every single time you did anything in that game, some character is going to comment on it in a very specific kind of a way, just like a real person in the real world would do. And so this idea of making games truly interactive, in the sense that they can hear you and respond to you, is possibly the future of storytelling in games. And that's a future that's here. It's a future that's emerging. So I just had to put this up because Inception's a cool movie. Okay, so my whole point with this second section is, understanding games is going to give you a huge advantage regardless of what creative industry you work in, because your audience is fluent in games. And if you can speak their language, you can connect with them in a new way. Okay, we're doing great, you guys. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So let's go to our third and final section. Another drink of water, hang on. Okay, so let's say like at this point, you're like, okay, I'm interested, but what does this actually mean? What does it mean to be a game writer? Is it like screenwriting, but weirder? Well, games truly are different. So let's talk about why. Let's talk about the most fundamental reason. So anyone who wants to be a writer gets into it because they love stories. They love writing, they love language, they love dialogue, they love all the parts that come together to create stories. And the challenge about writing for games is that we aren't telling a story, meaning we don't create a story and then put it in front of the player who then passively absorbs it the same way, a film audience or a TV audience does. When we're working on a game, when we're writing for a game, what we're doing is helping the player create their own story. And this really gets back to player agency, and anyone who's played a game knows all about this, right? So player agency is the player's ability to impact the story or the game, anything, through the game design or gameplay. It's the feeling that your actions matter to the story, right? So back to that Telltale example, You have a conversation with a character, you say something, and they go, I'll remember that. And that affects how the story unfolds for you. And so player agency is incredibly important. And it's like the #1 difference between game writing and any other form of writing. So then the question becomes, how much agency do we have to give the players? How much do we have to give the story over to the player, basically? Well, every studio kind of figures this out and comes up with their own answer to this question. Because here's the thing, players want both. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to have freedom to play their game and have all their agency, but then they really love having a game with a great narrative. And so it's a challenge for game writers and game developers. And like I said, each studio sort of like comes up with their own answer for the question. Some games like Skyrim are like, do what you want. You do you, boo. Which is awesome for gameplay, but it makes it really hard to craft a narrative. Storytelling in games like this is a little bit catch as catch can, to say the least. And on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have some games that kind of put you on rails. This very much frustrates like purist gamers who want to be able to do whatever they want anytime. But for story loving players like me, I love it. So when I play an Uncharted game or I play Florence, I'm on a ride, right? I have agency and I can do things, but I can do less, but in exchange, I get a better story. And that's an exchange that I'm willing to make. So there are different games out there for different types of players. And as a creative person yourself, both of these offer these both ends of the spectrum, like from Skyrim to Uncharted, both offer great creative storytelling opportunities. It just really comes down to what kind of challenges you would like to struggle with at work every day. That helps you figure out where you'd like to do your work. The big takeaway is that players want to feel free. That's really the key. So like when I play Uncharted, I feel free because it doesn't bother me to be on rails. But my partner, who is a game designer, does not feel free. He feels very trapped, right? So it's about knowing who your players are and just creating a feeling of freedom. It doesn't mean they literally are free. Even a very open game like Skyrim has tons of rules. You can't actually do everything you want. You can just do what the game allows you to do. So freedom in a game is always an illusion, but it's a fun illusion. Okay, so I've been dancing around it a little bit. You might be like, yeah, but what do game writers do? So let's talk about it. Let's talk about this seemingly simple question, because it turns out it's a little bit tricky to answer. So I have to unpack it a little bit. And we'll do it by comparing it to other kinds of writing. Okay, so what does a novelist write? I think you guys can finish this sentence, no problem. A novelist writes a novel. Right, okay. What does a screenwriter write? Well, that's easy too, right? Writes a screenplay. What does a game writer write? Well, okay, not a screenplay, not a game screenplay. Parts of it might be screenplay format, the cutscenes, but the overall work that a game writer does is not anything that is like a contained artifact, something you can touch and pick up like a book or a screenplay. So, right, that's what I'm trying to say. It's not like a standalone artifact, right? We do all this work within the context of the game. Good game scripts are designed to be like integrated with gameplay so closely that they can't be separated from gameplay. So you're writing a bunch of material that then would appear dynamically for the player, which means it appears all over the place potentially. And it's all context dependent. It all depends on what the player did before, which is going to be different for every player because every player plays the game differently. So, the key is that like game scripts don't stand alone. We don't it's not like a relay race, like in screenwriting where you write a script, you finish it, you hand it off, and then it goes into production. Everything is developed simultaneously. You're working on story until the game ships. You're working on the gameplay mechanics until the game ships. You're working on the code base until the game ships. Everything. Story is good story, when it works, is embedded in all the other game elements. You really don't even want to know where one ends and the other begins. So it's something it's hard to define. It's sort of like, well, it's like salt. It's like it's in it, you can't see it, but it's in everything in the meal. That's maybe the best way to explain it. So you might be sitting there thinking, okay, well, that seems like a really hard way to write a game script. That seems like game writing is harder than it needs to be. But right now it's the right way to do it. Because again, it's all about the player, and it's about how do we create a great experience that invites the player in and makes the story playable. There's this great book called The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell. I love this book. And he writes in it, and I think this explains what I'm trying to say so well. He says, what is the game designer's goal? At first, the answer seems obvious. A game designer's goal is to design games. But this is wrong. Ultimately, a game designer does not care about games. Games are merely a means to an end. On their own, games are just things. Games are worthless unless people play them. Why is this? What magic happens when games are played? When people play games, they have an experience. It is this experience that the designer cares about. Without the experience, the game is worthless. And I would argue that it's true for story as well, right? When people play games, they have an experience. It is this experience that the right game writer cares about. Without the experience, the story is worthless. And so what we do, to answer the question, what does a game writer do? A game writer creates an emotional experience for the player using whatever tools that are at their disposal, including but not limited to words. So that is what a game writer does. Game writer collaborates with everyone on the team to use visuals, to use music, to use the environment, to use gameplay mechanics, and yes, dialogue, and bring them all together to create an emotional experience for the player. Okay, I think this is the last section, guys, and then we'll have Q&A. What the future holds. Let's take a quick peek. These are examples of games that I think are telling stories as only games could. So if you've had a chance to play Brothers, it's amazing. So the way that Brothers works is you control both brothers, one on each stick on your controller. And one is very strong, and one brother is a little bit weaker and more sickly. And you have to help each other move through the game. And it is, I don't want to say more than that because I don't want to give anything away, but if you have a chance to play this game, it is incredible how affecting it is. And it gets you really invested in both of these characters in really special ways. And that's something that I think you can only do in a game because you can't control characters in a movie, but you can here. Another game that I think really points to the future is a Canadian game, Mass Effect 3. This is a great example of creating a real relationship between the player and the player character. If you've played it, you know, they've got this way the dialogue is set up. When a non-player character speaks to you and you can respond, of course, you can choose from the dialogue tree what your response is. But Shepard doesn't just repeat what you said, because that would sound weird. And he doesn't stand there silently, because that would be weird. Instead, he builds on what you said. He kind of completes your thought. As Jesse Schell said in a talk, it's like you and your avatar are a little team. It's like a buddy movie. And again, it's really satisfying because you really are partnered up basically with your avatar. And that's the character that you spend most of the time in the game with. So that's the character you probably care about the most. Again, something only a game could do. And then finally, What Remains of Edith Finch is really thought-provoking because it's a game that plays with the player. It sort of takes what BioShock did and plays around with the same concepts. The game has a mind of its own, and it takes unreliable narrator concept and pushes it in a very fun and satisfying kind of way. So those are 3 examples. I bet you could think of a dozen more. But once you start looking for these examples of like, where are stories happening that could only happen in a game, you start seeing more and more examples. It really is a new world, you guys. It's a new frontier. It's an exciting time, to be totally honest. And even if you never do this for a living, I hope that this was like thought-provoking and got your wheels spinning, and got you excited about like the next game you're going to play. Okay, so let's review. What did we talk about today? Well, we talked about how games will impact your creative career, even if you never work in games. It's not limited to writing, guys. So if you go into the arts in any capacity, what's going on in games will matter. We talked about why game writers don't actually write a story and what they do instead, which is create that emotional experience for the player. And then finally, we took a quick peek at the kinds of stories that only games can tell. And that, everybody, is my talk. Hooray! So I'm going to stop sharing, and I think we're going to start our Q&A. Yay!
That was so fabulous. Thank you so much.
Woo.
Fabulous, fabulous. So I'm going to ask everybody, please throw your questions for Susan into the Q&A. You can see there's a little button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That'll help us kind of like distinguish between like questions, and then general chat and enthusiasm.
Oh, yeah. Which is awesome. I love that, but yes.
much love being thrown your way.
Yeah. That's awesome. So I'm gonna, while questions are being added to the Q&A, I'm gonna just type in I'm gonna add in, I'm gonna type my answer into the Q&A. Please check out my blog, which again, I'm not trying to cop out. I did answer this a little bit already. And for the really in-depth answers, I think the best thing to do is go look through for in-depth answers. Here we go. Okay, great. So if you feel like you still would like me to talk about it in more detail, just feel free to ask again and just give me more specifics and I can try and dial it in. Okay, I see a question from Layla. Alison, should I just read off the questions like this? Does that work for you?
Until they start like pouring in, let's do that, and then I'll start filtering to.
Okay, perfect. If it starts spilling, then I'll hand the cue part over to you. Okay, awesome. Okay, so Layla writes, do game writers tend to write for a specific company? So for example, working on all the games that a company is currently producing, or do they typically work as freelancers moving from game to game? Great question. So most game writers work at a company because of what I talked about games being so embedded with, writing is so embedded with all the other departments. It's really hard to be really super involved with the art department, the audio department, the animators, the audio, everybody. If you're far away, not the remote part, obviously, as we talked about, remote work totally works. But if you're a freelancer, you're just there for a little while and then you go away. But what a lot of studios need you to do is have story and gameplay integrated. And that really does mean you kind of being either a long-term freelancer or a staff writer. And then if the studio is big enough, what you'll do is you'll bounce from project to project. And that's a really good situation to be in. The magic number for a studio in terms of like being big enough to have more than one game in production is 30. That's the magic number you want to look for. So if you want to find a studio where you can work on more than one project, just be sure that the studios you're looking at have at least 30 employees. That said, some people are freelancers, but the people who are freelancers, like I'm a freelancer, but I've been doing this forever and ever and ever. And I'm not even a writer anymore. I'm a consultant. So what I do is I come in and I help other writers. I basically teach them, just like I teach in my game writing masterclass, but I'm doing it within the context of their project. So I would say for starting out, I would definitely I would like say, okay, I really would like to find a staff role. And you can do it for a year or two, see how you like it. And if you don't, you can say, okay, I'm going freelance and figure that out. But I would say staff writing is the way to start for sure. Okay, Alison. Should I keep going?
Okay, I'm going to suggest Myri's just got a little follow-up question. Just
Great.
wondering what if you could expand more on the actual structure slash format of how games are written. Are flowcharts involved? Because we've just done a flowchart exercise
Mm,
this week. Sort of a what does a typical day in the life of a game writer look like kind of thing.
okay. Okay. Um, so okay, let's see. So again, I'm going to answer this, but I'm also going to give you a blog post because yes. Okay, so this answers this question. So the short version is, I'll do it after I answer this question. So the question is, oh, it's gone. Here it is. Oh no, did I lose her question? I wanted to look at it again.
No, it's
Oh, there it is. I see it. I see it. Okay. I was wondering if you could expand more. Okay, so the format is, the short version is there's going to be two sections to a game. If you're telling the story with words, which I don't recommend, I think words are the last tool you should use when it comes to storytelling in games, because game players can skip all the cinematics and can turn off the audio or tune out the dialogue. So whenever I take a first pass at a story, telling a story in a game, I look for ways of doing it without a single word. That's my first draft. Just doing it through audio cues and animation and whatever. And Florence is a perfect example. There's no dialogue in that game whatsoever, like one word or two, and it tells a beautiful story. So that's the first way you start. And then if you're like, okay, I do have to actually put some words down. There's going to be two parts of it. There's going to be the cutscenes, and the cutscenes are going to be just like a screenplay. Same format because cutscenes are non-interactive. So they're just little tiny films. And if they're good, they're little tiny stories with a really satisfying beginning, middle, and end. But they're just one small part of our work. And then if everything else that's going to be in game is going to be dynamic. And so it's got to kind of, like I was saying, it gets triggered by player behavior. And that's often the final version of it is delivered in some kind of database, because the programmers have to be able to grab it and then populate the game code with it so that the right line of dialogue triggers when the player action takes place. So in the final pass, a lot of times what game writers will do is they will like do all their writing wherever they want to, but then they've got to move it, export it over to a spreadsheet when they're done. And then typical day in the life of a game writer just involves lots of meetings and lots of collaboration and lots of brainstorming with other creative people from other disciplines. That's the short version of that answer. And then let me add in to finish up. Here is, again, the blog's going to have a lot of this stuff, but I think this will help you. It's called What a Game Script Looks Like. And it's actually a follow-up to my most popular article of all time, which is, what does a game script look like? Or yeah, how to write a script for games. So let me see if I can add that to what I sent you to. Hang on one second. Type answer. Here we go. Oops, that's not the one. Sorry.
Just to reassure everybody, I will be posting these on our e-class.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so I just sent you two, and I hope that helps. Okay.
And just to kind of follow up on the question of like words versus any other kinds of tools, the final project that we're doing in this class is a twine game. We actually have the creative restriction that it has to be only words. So
okay.
Sound or visuals or anything like that.
Good, good.
But, you know, it's an interesting creative restriction.
It is. And I mean, I think for a student project or a resume piece or like prototyping ideas when you're inside of a studio, that's perfect. You know, because at that point, what you're just trying to do is get some ideas down on the page, and words are the quickest way to get versus trying to find the right audio or the right picture. But once you know what the story is and how the player experiences the story, then you can bring other. It only makes sense if you're working in a studio, because the whole point is you use all these other tools because you have access to people who can make those tools for you. If it's just you, stick with words.
Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I knew I was going to have a question about that later.
Yes, yes. Unless you've got an art department that will do the work for you, and you don't.
Yes. So I'm going to like put two questions together. Just before this webinar, students watched like little clips for Bioshock, Far Cry 2, and Rise of the Tomb Raider.
Okay.
So Joanna's asking, what was your favorite things to work on so far? And Haroon's asking, are there big hurdles that you overcame while working on these massive game franchises? How did you overcome them?
Mm. My favorite thing to work on so far was actually a game that never saw the light of day, but it was with the Canadian company out of Vancouver. And I just loved, and I can't say what the game was. I mean, non-disclosure agreements are very serious, and this game was canceled, unfortunately. But in terms of like the working relationship I had with the team, it was the absolute best. The designer and he was just so good at communicating, and we were able to overcome our like misunderstandings really well because we both worked really hard on communicating with each other. And so it went from like how it sometimes is with writers and designers where you're kind of bumping heads, and it became this incredible collaboration, like kind of blowing each other's minds all the time, like, what, whoa, you can do what now? So I loved that, and I think that is the most important thing to look for when you're working in games. Games are so incredibly collaborative that the kind of game you're working on matters to some degree, but it's the people you work with. That's what really matters. I mean, it's not like screenwriting where you sit in a room by yourself, tickety tackety, and then you like hand the script off, you know? I mean, if you like people, you're going to love working in games because they are in your face. You know what it's kind of like? It's like college. Like what I loved about college was that there were so many smart people around, but they were smart in so many different ways, you know? You got the liberal arts, you know, you had the science people, you had the engineers, you had the this, you had the that, the drama people. That's what I loved about college. And that's exactly what a game studio is. It is just a bunch of really smart people that are smart in different ways, having to find ways to work together to make a fun game. Your whole job is to make something that is fun, that makes people happy. I mean, that is pretty sweet. So if you can find people that don't have most people in games don't have egos. They're very collaborative because it's the only way to be. So most people that you meet in games you're going to like, but sometimes you just love who you work with. And those are the people you just wish you could work with the rest of your career. So yeah. So that's the answer to that. And then Haroon's question, are there bigger hurdles you overcame while working on these massive game franchises? How did you overcome them? Well, I mean, so as you know, I'm sure you guys know, I mean, I have to be careful because there's non-disclosure agreements, which means I'm not allowed to talk about specifics regarding projects. I'm under a cone of silence. I think the biggest challenge, so I'll just speak in general terms. I mean, the biggest challenges you're going to encounter on a project have everything to do with time and money. Do we have enough time to do this? Do we have enough money to do this? Because everything costs time and money, and that just becomes an endlessly shrinking resource on a project. And so, the way that you overcome these, so for example, sometimes you put a story together on a project, and then because this industry doesn't have a really good way of prototyping story content, sometimes the story content and the gameplay content get integrated kind of late, which is not the way to do it, by the way, but sometimes it happens. And then when that happens, sometimes what you discover is your story doesn't really fit with the game, and what are we going to do? And that's where the time and money problem comes up, because if you had infinite time and infinite money, you would just start everything over and rework the story to work with the game, but you don't have the time. So the way that I've overcome these kinds of problems is I became a teacher, because when you become a teacher, you have to learn how to explain the things you've been doing kind of by guesswork. You have to actually think about what you do and like explain it clearly. And once you've explained it clearly to other people, you can explain it clearly to yourself, and then you can explain it to coworkers. So I really relied on like the time that I've spent studying the fundamentals of storytelling, because the fundamentals of storytelling still apply, even in a game, because humans are hardwired for story. And we tell stories to ourselves to explain what's happening all the time. I mean, when we describe the game we were playing last night to our friend, we do it in the form of a story. So even though it's a new medium, games, this machine between our ears is like the oldest one there is. And so when a story isn't working in a game, instead of thinking we've got to throw everything out and start over, I just get back to fundamentals. And I go, okay, what are the basics here? And how do games take those fundamentals, those basics, and kind of bend them? Games don't break the rules of storytelling. They just bend them. So really understanding how those rules get bent and then applying those to the projects made us realize that, like, oh, that's actually a pretty simple solution. So, like, for example, let's say hypothetically, I was working on a game and the play test results are coming back, and the players were like, I don't understand the story. I don't get it. They had these analysts come in and they're like, if you don't fix this story, your project is going to like drop a full 10 points on Metacritic, which is a really big deal to a team because oftentimes people's bonuses are tied to the Metacritic scores, which is, love it or hate it, it's just a fact. So they were really interested in fixing the story, but they could not make a whole lot of changes because, remember, time and money. So they had me come in and take a look and see what the problem was. And the problem was real simple. The problem was that what the player wanted to do and what the player character wanted to do were different. So you'd have these cutscenes where you'd have this character be like, oh my God, I really want to, do this, do X. It's the most important thing. And then as soon as the cutscene ends, the player wants to do the opposite of X. Right? It's like the character is like, I don't want to fight. And then as soon as the cutscene's over, it's like, it's go time. And I was like, you need the player character to want the same thing the player wants. You need to change those lines to align them with the player. And that's what we did. And the game shipped, and it did really well with Metacritic and with the players. And so hooray. But yeah, getting back to fundamentals is how I dealt those hurdles.
Fabulous. So I'm going to put a couple more together. Leanna is asking, do you have any suggestions on how to frame or design a portfolio for narrative writing geared towards game studios? What kinds of examples should be highlighted? And Arvin is asking regarding getting yourself out into the industry and portfolios. What do you think about joining small indie game companies that start out, or should you get more experience in different companies and medias first?
Okay. So, yes, don't forget about the blog post, Arvian. I won't. In fact, I'm going to give you one right now. So this is something I wrote called How to Get a Job in Games, even if you haven't shipped a title yet. So I'm going to go ahead and post that for you, but I'll answer both of these questions. So how do you design a portfolio for narrative writing geared towards game studios? So the things that a studio wants to know are three things. They want to know, can you write? They want to know, do you have some understanding of what it means to tell a story in a game? And are you easy to work with? Number three, don't worry about that one because that'll come across in the interview. Okay. Although testimonials are really good, people say nice things about you, add that to your portfolio, but mostly that'll happen in the interview. So in a portfolio, you just need to prove 1 and 2. Let's start with number 1. Can you write? To show that, give them writing samples. And don't give them game writing samples. Okay, well, that's part of number 2. But for number 1, give them writing samples that are easy to read, meaning they make sense on the page. Because remember, a good game script doesn't make sense on a page. Game scripts are not meant to be out of context. They're meant to be in the game. So give them a writing sample, meaning a screenplay, a TV script. It could be one scene. Give them a short story, give them, I'm sure you've taken lots of writing classes or you're going to, that is great material for your portfolio, right? That shows your voice as a writer. And that's really important because not everybody can write. And people who are good writers have probably been good writers their entire lives and really take it for granted. But trust, not everybody can write well. So if you've got the gift, by all means, let them see it and do it in again, traditional writing formats are perfect because they're easy to read, right? So that's where you start. That's their first thing. If you can't show that you can write, they're going to move on. So that's your first hurdle to overcome. And then your second hurdle is a little trickier, but a little strategy will get you there. So how do I show that I understand how to write for games? Okay, so one of the ways you do it is you do what you're doing in this class. You make a twine game and you share it in your portfolio. A twine game shows that you can make a story playable, that you can create a story with the player in mind, right? So it's not just like blah, 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 turn the page, blah, 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 turn the page, which, sometimes happens. How can you invite the player into the experience? How can you make their choices matter? That's what a twine game allows you to do. Another way that you can show that you understand storytelling for games, that you've really thought about it, and you can talk about it like a pro, is by doing a book report on a game narrative. In fact, there's a resource that they might be interested in. Let me think of hang on one second. Game Narrative Vault. I think that's what it's called. Yeah. Have you shared the Game Narrative Vault with them by any chance?
Is it the GDC student contest?
Yes.
Yes, I will share that link with them.
Okay. Okay, I'll drop that in the chat just to so you've got it. Okay, GDC narrative. So it's a great resource in two ways. Number one, this is just nothing but book reports on games, narratives from college students. So it's awesome as a resource. And it's actually, I was part of the group that started this competition. And the reason we did it is to give working game writers a library, because it's time consuming to play games, especially if you want to see the whole story. And working game writers don't always have time to play all the games. So this is a great way to sort of get a sense of how different studios have crafted narratives for their players. The other thing that this is really cool is that we take submissions, and then if you win, you get a free pass to GDC, and you get introduced to the whole industry. It's a chance for you to sort of have your in the South, we do the cotillion, sort of hello, everybody, I'm here now. But it's really fun. It's a fun way to kind of kickstart your career in games. So anyway, it's a really cool resource across the board. So Leanne, that's what I would focus on. Can I write, and can I write for games? Those are the two questions that you want to work towards being able to answer for studios inside of your portfolio. I feel like I might have written something about a portfolio in my blog, but if I didn't, I clearly need to. So I'm gonna make a quick note to myself, portfolio post, portfolio blog.
And folks can also search your blog too, right? For a keyword like portfolio.
Yeah. Yes, maybe I should do that. Yeah, it's a new feature. I'm so thank God there's a search function now. It's so great. Yeah, there's not. Well, sort of. Okay. Well, anyway, just take a look. Back to the questions. So I answered Leanna, and then the other one was, can you remind me which the other one was?
You answered that as well.
Oh, okay, great.
In the written.
Great.
So that's great. There's one from Emma here, and I think this is a useful thing to follow those up, which is it difficult to find jobs in the game industry, especially as a writer? What's the
no, I don't think that it is, but you do have to work at it. I mean, because here's the thing, again, game studios the work is so collaborative. And so the way that you get a job is not by just, they call it spray and pray, where you just send out a bunch of resumes to everyone and just hope that somebody likes it. A resume will never get you hired. I mean, you've really got to they have to get to know you as a person. And that just involves building up your community / network. And that takes time, and it's nerve-wracking, especially for introverts. You have to learn how to be strategic about it, meaning make sure you're doing it. That's all I mean about strategy. It's just okay, I've got to start meeting people in this industry. How do I do it? And then there's answers to that, right? So for example, you can follow game devs on Twitter. I know Twitter's, who knows what's going on with Twitter, but right now, plenty of game devs on Twitter, and you can follow anybody you want on there. So, you can start getting to know different game devs that way. And you can go to events. You can go to IGDA events, International Game Developers Association. Most places, including Toronto for sure, have monthly or regular in-person meetups. That's a great place to meet people. So it's really going to come out of your network. I don't know if it's, I mean, as you know, Alison, we did a whole thing on it. It's a mindset thing, the job search thing. It's about overcoming fear of rejection and a lot of stuff that's not easy to do. So whether it's easy or hard kind of depends on how willing you are to kind of put yourself out there. because that's what it requires, unfortunately, sorry. But studios need people desperately. I mean, when I talk to my friends who run studios, they talk about how hard it is to find the right writer for their projects. So, you guys want to find each other. So the best thing you can do is be as findable as possible. Have a great portfolio and meet as many game devs as you can.
Fantastic. So we're currently at quarter past the hour, and we want to make sure that we get through as many of these as possible. We're probably going to have time for about two more, should we say? So let's try. Jonathan's asking, have you ever gone through writer's block when you're writing games? And if so, how have you dealt with it? Also, what made you want to do game writing?
Okay. No, there's no time for writer's block. Writer's block, you can't give into that. I mean, you have to just work. It is just put the pen down. I mean, no one has talker's block, and if you don't have talker's block, then you don't, I mean, I get it. People can talk. We are our own worst enemies sometimes. We can overthink things. There's no doubt about it. But the beauty of this work is that because it's so collaborative, it's not just you in a room stewing in your own juices. You are like, if you're stuck, go talk to people on the team. They're going to have plenty of ideas for you, whether you want them or not. And so what you do is hang on, Slack is on. Let me just quit it so it stops beeping at me. So yeah, writer's block. I mean, there are storytelling problems that I'm not sure how to solve. And that's a little different than writer's block is like, I don't know what to write. Which is, again, there's no time for it. You're under a deadline, It's like journalists don't have writer's block because they've got to ship stuff. And it's the same with game writers. I think it's people who don't have deadlines suffer from writer's block because they have the luxury of it, honestly. But deadlines are your best friend. I love deadlines. I love giving deadlines in my class. I love doing writing prompts in my workshops. As you remember, on Wednesdays, I would give a writing prompt and I would always make it as hard as I could. And I'm like, you've got 15 minutes, go. Everybody did it. Everybody did it, because they didn't have time to overthink it. So if you ever get a really brutal deadline, just think, yes. The other problem is, I've got a storytelling problem I don't know how to solve and I'm stuck. And when that happens, the trick is to reach out to other game writers and say, okay, like, have you ever faced this problem and how did you deal with it? And that's where community comes in. And that's why I'm such a big proponent for like developing a community, not just of game developers, but of game writers and narrative designers. In terms of what made me want to do game writing, I wanted to write for a living. I wanted to be a writer. So it's as simple as that.
Fantastic. So I am seeing just two more questions here, so I think we can
Sure.
make this work. So Jada asking, I'm not sure if you would know about this, but I saw the slide about Amazon pushing to make video games. And what do you make of them making games against the more established and known companies such as Microsoft, Sony, and Ubisoft? Can Amazon still succeed at making a viral game?
I don't know. I mean, I think that studios like Netflix are being smart because they're acquiring game studios. And maybe Amazon is doing the same. I mean, the reality is, I mean, look at Google, they shut down Stadia. Big tech and games don't have as much in common as big tech thinks. Like the development process is just very different. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, we're using technology, but we're using technology to make art. And places like Google and Amazon are using technology to make money. And games make money too. I don't want to open up a big debate, but the creative process requires a certain level of chaos that drives engineers at places like Google and Amazon crazy. But so if they really want to do it, they have to solve the culture clash problem. If they acquire a game studio, they've got to let the game studio be a game studio, not a subsidiary of a tech company. And this is a really expensive mistake that I see these people making over and over and over again, but there are really smart people there, who theoretically could learn from their mistakes. So, it remains to be seen. Hasn't happened yet. So, I think it's good to be a little bit like eyebrow raised, like, we'll see, but never say never.
Fabulous.
Yeah, great question, by the way. Very thoughtful. I love that.
Yes, very, very cool. So the last question we've got in the Q&A here is from Michael, and I'm going to sort of set the scene for this, given that it is the last question. This week we're doing, the theme of the week is setting. What is
Okay.
setting? And sort of world and environmental storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So Michael's question is, where would you have the most success in finding a job in game design, specifically in or outside of Toronto or remotely if I wanted to go that route? Sort of thinking about setting both in and out of games.
Okay. 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 So is the question about setting and world building, or is the question more about?
The question is sort of more about, do I have to leave Toronto, I think,
Yes.
basically.
Yes. Answer is no, you do not have to leave Toronto. There's lots of game studios in Toronto. And this is where, here, in fact, I'm going to do this really quick. Again, that website that I mentioned, Game Dev Map, I'm going to browse right now. I'm going to go to Canada. I'm going to, what, forgive me. This is so American ignorant of me. What province is
Ontario.
Toronto in? Ontario. Okay, thank you. You knew I was going to ask that. You're like, I'm sorry, you guys. Okay, Toronto. There are 133 studios in Toronto. You only need a job at one. So I'll put this game dev map. The funny thing about this website is that you've got to, it works from right to left. So you start by choosing your country on the right, and then you dial it in province, city. And then within city, I should say, I'm being a little flip here. It's not just studios, it lists everything. So you'll need to you can sort by developer. So a developer is someone who develops the game. And the publisher are the people who finance the game and market the game, but they don't make the game. The developer develops the game. And there's a few other company types that are listed. So, but they're all worth checking out, for sure. So I would look at all company types, and then other times I just sorted again by developer, and there's 87 developers. So it's 87 companies who make games in Toronto. Pretty good.
Pretty amazing. Yeah, just sort of thinking about the fact that, you here talking to us on Zoom 3 years ago, this would have felt a little bit like science fiction. We would have thought if you had
Yeah.
a guest speaker, they would have had to show up on campus in Toronto, flying in from Texas,
Yep.
making climate change. And the world has shifted.
Yeah, it has, and it's still shifting. It's wild. Just have to surf it at this point. Just surf the wave, because who knows what's going on. But I love this. I'm so grateful. Honestly, I'm so grateful to the people who built Zoom. This thing is awesome. It just works 90% of the time, and we're able to do stuff like this. We're very lucky in that sense. It's awesome.
We really are. Yeah, so any sort of last words of advice you have to the next generation coming up? I mean, you've been giving walls of words of advice.
Well, I think I guess my last thought would be you can make a living doing anything, so you might as well focus on making a living doing something you're really excited about. I think that gets lost in the shuffle sometimes when people think about what they want to do with their lives. Also, nothing you do is permanent. Try stuff. If you try a career path and you don't like it, quit. I mean, sounds like it's a big deal. It's really not. People reinvent themselves all the time. And the truth about creative people, they are constantly reinventing themselves. We never get tired of wanting to do something new. And that's a feature, not a bug. So yeah, just go for it. Whatever you want to try, just go for it. Because if I can make a living as a game writer, is that's even a job? Yes. If I can do that, you can do it. You can do whatever you want. Every job you can think of if someone else has that job, you can have that job. So sky's the limit.
Well, I want to say on behalf of York University and the Department of Cinema and Media Arts and this class, thank you so much for joining us here across the miles and just giving so generously of your insights and your experience and your encouragement. I think that's what's really wonderful about what you give to the world is that you're just constantly putting out there on your blog, in your masterclasses and in talks like this, encouragement for people to do, to create and not just
Yes.
consume.
Yes. Yes, we need more. We need more people creating beautiful things, especially things we haven't seen before, you know. So I'm excited that we've got a new generation coming up. Can't wait to play the games you make someday.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, and we will see you on your blog.
Yeah. See you soon, guys. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.